The research on attachment with Harry Harlow and the rhesus monkeys shows us that early relationships are critical for healthy development. What we're looking at here is a table displaying Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. And before we outline each individually, let's talk about the theory in general. So first, it's interesting to note that Erikson was a student of Sigmund Freud. And if we think about what we've learned about Sigmund Freud already, one of the most important components of the psychodynamic theory is the importance of early childhood experiences. Freud basically argued that there is a completely important relationship or a link between what happens to us as a child and the personalities that we develop as an adult. So Erikson took that idea and furthered it by detailing exactly what types of relationships are important at different stages of life and ultimately how we think and feel about those relationships, hence the term psychosocial stages of development. So first and foremost, we are born and we enter stage one, trust versus mistrust. The idea here is that an infant is born basically helpless. We can't do much on our own when we're first born. We rely on others for food and for shelter. And so if my needs as a baby are met, the ones that I cannot satisfy on my own, if those needs are satisfied, I'm going to develop a sense of trust with the people around me. In other words, I'm going to feel that people are good, that people are, safe to be around. Because ultimately, why would I think anything else? This is the first experience I've had with a relationship. And so if everything goes well, as we see here, if my nourishment and affection needs are met, I'm going to look at people positively. Before we go on, let's again back up. The point of this theory is to argue that what happens to us in these early stages is going to affect our personality and our development later in life. So if I develop a sense of trust in this first year of life, ultimately I'll move forward, in the future, more willing to trust others. And therefore, I'll probably have a higher likelihood of getting into, positive relationships that are based on trust, as opposed to things like insecurity and jealousy and things like that. So trust versus mistrust, it's all about satisfying those basic infant needs that the baby cannot satisfy on their own. But then the baby becomes a little more independent or autonomous. Stage 2 is called autonomy versus shame and doubt. And so in this stage, basically, young children are learning to assert themselves. They're basically trying to, become more independent and self-sufficient. And the task that Erikson focused on primarily was potty training. So imagine that a child is, in the first stage of life, whenever the child has to go to the bathroom, they just do it in their diaper because their caretaker will change their diaper whenever it's necessary. But now, in order to become a successful member of our society, we obviously have to control our bowels and we have to be able to do a number of things independently. So potty training is really, the first glimpse at autonomy or independence. But again, this entire theory focuses on the importance of relationships. So the most important relationships early in life are, of course, parents. And that means that parents have to provide suitable guidelines for their kids. So when it comes to potty training, that means that, of course, kids are going to make a mistake. They're going to wet the bed, for example. And importantly, their parents should not shame them for that mistake. They should encourage, positive behaviors. And when it comes to negative behaviors, maybe telling the child, it's okay, this happens, you'll get it next time. Because basically the child needs to learn that it's okay to try new things on your own, to be independent, and it's okay to make mistakes. And when you make a mistake, you'll grow from that, you'll learn from that, and that's how we all better ourselves, and that's how we become independent members of our society. Stage 3 kind of piggybacks off of this sense of independence, and it's all about initiative, trying new things. So the age categories that Erikson assigned to this stage, ages 3 to 6, these are the preschool years. So now you're independent, you're walking, you're running, you're skipping, you're jumping, but you're not in school yet. So you still have lots of freedom, if you will, and it's important to try, new things, to take initiative. So for example, imagine you have a child who they get a new toy for their birthday, and maybe it's a car toy, and they're rolling it around the house, and it's kind of fun. But then they get bored, and so they decide to take some initiative. They take some paper and they cut out some wings. They paste the wings onto the truck, and they throw it outside the window of their second story of their home. It flies out the window, it falls to the ground, and breaks in a million pieces. So, of course, something bad happened. Their toy broke, but they were trying something new. They were taking initiative. And now it's the parents' job to interact in a pro-social way. Again, this is all about relationships. So if the parents, they look at the child and they say, you know what, you broke your toy, but I'm proud of you for trying something new. You came up with a really interesting idea, and maybe you'll be a scientist one day or an engineer. On the other hand, if a child is chastised or, punished really severely, they might develop a sense of guilt. Maybe Sigmund Freud might call that the superego, might be overinflated. And so that might teach the child not to try new things, because that one time that they tried something new and it resulted in a bad outcome, their parents got extremely angry. And, my parents are the people who matter most to me. So they're going to affect the way that I think and feel about all relationships in general. Again, if we take these early stages and fast forward, maybe the child who develops a strong sense of initiative and purpose when they're a child, they develop into an adult who carries that with them. They're the individual at work who's always, a go-getter, and they're trying new things, and they're always, interested in just building upon things, as opposed to the child who develops a sense of guilt and, feels that trying new things is bad because it tends to always, result in negative outcomes. All right. Stage 4 is the school years, the early elementary school years. And Erikson termed the stage industry versus inferiority. So for the first time, we start to focus on relationships other than parents. At least, generally speaking, we develop friendships or peer comparisons. So you go to school, and not only do your parents matter, but all these other kids around you matter. And so we start to compare ourselves. My self-esteem, the way I think and feel about myself, is largely influenced based on relative, am I good at things relative to the people around me? And so industry basically means being competent, being good at things. So for example, when it comes to school, am I good at spelling? Am I good at math? Am I good at sports? Do people like to hang out with me? If these things are, overwhelmingly answered with the answer yes, a child develops a sense of industry. They have self-confidence in their abilities. And on the other hand, if a child feels that, everybody else is better than them in all these domains, they basically develop a sense of inferiority. That, I don't measure up compared to the people around me. So this can stick with the individual. It can give them a complex. The person who feels industrious as a child might be the person who develops into an adult who, again, is productive and always, feeling like they are good and measure up compared to those around them, as opposed to the individual who feels inferior. All right. Stage 5 is where we take a really big turning point, because this is the adolescent years. So the major developmental milestone, physically speaking, is puberty. Puberty brings about dramatic physical change. We are, sexually mature, but our body also looks dramatically different. For example, we might gain 10 to 12 inches in height across the years 12 to 18. So that brings about a lot of self-exploration. The question, who am I, really begins to get contemplated in adolescence. So the name of this stage is identity versus confusion. Erikson believed that it is critical for us to explore our self-identity during this stage of life. So that means, figuring out, how do you want to dress? What types of hobbies are you interested in? You can start contemplating religion, the existence of God, for example. I want to say something about that. Young children certainly can believe in God, but in terms of cognitive complexity, it's not until adolescence that we can contemplate abstract ideas. And belief in God is certainly an abstract idea. And so now it can be really forming part of their identity in terms of a realistic, understanding of what it means in terms of faith. What else? We have, interactions with others can be more meaningful because you can say, I'm interested in these things and you're interested in the same things. So that we can connect on that level, on that term, in terms of identity. All right, but on the other hand, there are individuals who are, maybe stuck in these earlier stages, if you will. And so maybe they're in a state of role confusion. They haven't really asked themselves, who am I or who do I want to become? People typically figure that out, but importantly, there's a number of reasons why individuals remain confused during adolescence. Many biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors play into this. Beginning in early adulthood, we enter the stage of intimacy versus isolation. And again, what we're seeing across every single stage here is the importance of relationships. But in this stage, the relationships that matter are really strong, deep, and meaningful relationships, deeper than ever before. So for one primary purpose, it could be reproduction. I think it's something like 90% of Americans get married. The majority of them have kids. So many people are establishing intimate relationships for reproductive purposes. But we can satisfy intimacy concerns in a number of ways in early adulthood. So obviously, besides romantic relationships, we can have extremely deep connections with others in terms of friendships. We can establish a mentor-mentee relationship at work. Maybe some more experienced individual at work takes you under their wing. You get really close with that individual as they show you the ins and the outs of the workplace. But importantly, loneliness peaks during early adulthood. And one argument is it's because this is the psychosocial concern, between ages 19 and 29, as Erikson would argue, where we're trying to really look for, deep relationships as opposed to having a bunch of, superficial relationships. We're not done growing once we are finished with early adulthood. The middle age years, somewhere between 30 and 64 years old, we still grow. We still grow and develop mentally, even if our bodies are still, beginning a decline. For example, biologically speaking, we tend to peak in the mid-20s. But psychologically and cognitively, we are getting more and more advanced. And one of the ways that we develop in terms of psychosocial development, according to Erikson, is through what's called generativity. Generativity basically is like passing the torch. You're trying to contribute to society in new ways. You're trying to give back. It's like you're no longer selfish. You're no longer focused on your own relationships, your own productivity. It's more about giving back to the community or younger members of society. So like I said, passing the torch. But on the other hand, something like 25% of Americans suffers from a mental disorder, and one of the most common is depression. And one large influence on depression in late adulthood or middle adulthood is stagnation. This concept of feeling like all your good days are behind you, you'll never grow, you'll never find anything worthwhile, worth living. You're not really interested in the youth. You're kind of still selfish and self-centered because maybe you have some psychological development still to come. Again, maybe there's some earlier stages that are still not satisfied in terms of the ability to reach generativity. So that brings us to the final stage. Arguably, maybe it's the most important stage, because this is our last sense of, looking at ourselves and where we've come from. The stage is integrity versus despair, ego integrity. What does that mean? It basically means, self-evaluation, but this is prompted by an awareness of our impending death. So we are aware that our life is coming to a close. Maybe we have, we've only been given a certain amount of time to live by a doctor, for example. That would certainly prompt one to reflect, how did things go? When I look back on my life, am I happy with the decisions I made? Did I live life with no regret? When I made mistakes, did I try to rectify those mistakes? People who say yes to those types of questions, they feel whole, they feel united, or as Erikson called it, ego integrity. And what's really important about that is not only do these people feel good about their life, they tend to feel better about their death. People with ego integrity, they survey lower on death anxiety. They don't certainly want to die, but they're more accepting of their death. On the other hand, there's despair. This is the idea that you're aware your life is coming to a close, and so you'll look back and you ask yourself, how did things go? And if you feel like you have all these regrets, there's all these things you wish you had done, but now you don't have time to do them, that's certainly going to bring about a very different feeling on your deathbed. And often, Erikson said people feel bitter and they have resentment because basically there's things that are, left unfinished, but there's not enough time to finish them. And so that, again, in terms of death anxiety, that tends to make people more apprehensive of death. All right, so the goal, according to this theory, of course, is ego integrity. We want to reach this stage. And so how do we do it? Well, obviously, easier said than done, but from a strictly oversimplified theoretical perspective, what we need is success at each one of these stages. We need trust, which will lead to autonomy. We need autonomy, which will lead to initiative, and then industry, and then identity, and then intimacy, and then generativity, and then ultimately this sense of feeling united and good about your life, ego integrity.